Hello and welcome to today's ACM Learning webinar. This webcast reflects ACM's deep commitment to lifelong learning, aiming to empower computing professionals and students who join ACM's worldwide community of over 100,000 members. My name is Tom Limoncelli. I'm proud to be an ACM member and volunteer. I'm an author and system administrator, and I work in New York City at stackoverflow.com. I will be your moderator for today's webinar. ACM offers innovative educational and professional development resources that bolster skill sets and enhance career development opportunities. Our members are able to stay competitive in the dynamic computing world with a range of ACM Learning Center online resources at learning.acm.org. You can see some of the highlights on your screen. ACM enables its members to solve critical problems through services such as timely computing information, including publications such as Communications of the ACM and Q, access to ACM's digital library, the world's most comprehensive database of computing literature, international conferences that draw leading experts on a broad spectrum of computing topics, and support for education and research, including curriculum development, teacher training, the ACM Turing and ACM Infosys Foundation Awards. Before we get started, I'd like to mention a few housekeeping items shown on the slide in front of you. You can enlarge slides by clicking the button on the upper right or dragging the lower right corner. The bottom panel lets you control the widgets and windows, including Facebook, Twitter, and other sharing tools. If you experience technical problems, we find it helps to reload the web page. Windows users press F5, Mac users press Command-R. On the last slide of the presentation, you'll see a survey URL. Please take a minute to fill it out. This session is being recorded and can be rewatched at learning.acm.com. You'll receive an email when it's available. At the end of our presentation, we'll have time for questions, and I hope you'll have several. If you think of a question during the presentation, please submit it via the Q&A box. You do not need to wait until the end of the presentation to begin submitting questions. We'd love to know what topics you'd like to see in the future. Please let us know via the Q&A box or the survey at the end. You can now use Facebook and Twitter widgets at the bottom panel to share the presentation links with your friends, as well as tweet comments and questions using the hashtag #ACMWebinarIPv6. Today's presentation is The Security Impact of IPv6 by Johannes Ullrich. Dr. Johannes Ullrich is the Dean of Research and a faculty member at the SANS Technical Institute. In November of 2000, Johannes started the DShield.org project, which became part of the Internet Storm Center. His work with the Internet Storm Center has been widely recognized. In 2004, Network World named him one of the 50 most powerful people in the networking industry. Secure Computing Magazine named him one of 2005's top 5 influential IT security thinkers. His research interests include IPv6, network traffic analysis, and secure software development. Johannes is regularly invited to speak at conferences and has been interviewed by major publications, radio, as well as TV. As Chief Security Officer for the SANS Institute, Johannes is currently responsible for the GIAC Gold program. He also maintains a daily security news summary podcast and frequently blogs about security, application security. Johannes, we look forward to your presentation here today.
Thank you very much for that introduction. And to get us started, I have a little poll set up here just to get a little feel for how people are with IPv6, who already has implemented it here, if anybody, and what your plans are if you haven't implemented it yet for the near future. So if you could please take a second and fill out that form, and then let's just take a look here and see what people submitted. Looks like, well, probably within the next 5 years, we actually got 18% here, 19% that already have IPv6 running. That's actually quite a large number compared to when I usually talk about IPv6. There may be kind of 1 or 2 people in the room that know they have IPv6 IPv6 running, but one of the things we'll talk about soon is that, well, many people may have IPv6 running without actually realizing it. Now, one of the questions that keeps coming up when we talk about IPv6 and why should we actually implement it, what's so great and different about IPv6 to make it worth the effort? Now, the common answer here is more address space. Of course, as of a couple of years ago, we kind of ran out of addresses, but it's really more than that. It is about scalability. The way I usually compare it is with the DC to AC conversion in electricity. First power grids in Manhattan, for example, were DC power grids. Were great, were very safe actually, but they didn't scale. They didn't scale across a larger area like into a national power grid the way we have it now. So what happened was that AC became the standard because of scalability. And actually one of the big concerns originally was that AC is less secure, and one of the counter arguments that was made, for example, by DC users like, for example, Edison, was well, how insecure AC is, and one of his stunts was to actually, it's told that he stole pets in New York City and then publicly electrocuted him. So let's take a quick look at where we are with IP. When IPv4 was originally designed, it was really designed to connect research networks, government labs. I always call IPv4 the research experiments that they forgot to turn off. So it was designed around millions of hosts as a research network, essentially around 70s, 80s hardware. So with systems that have kilobytes, maybe megabytes of RAM, not gigabytes like we have them today. So it's a very different network that we use today than IPv4 was actually designed around. We exceeded pretty much every single design criteria for IPv4 by a few orders of magnitudes. And as far as addresses is concerned, we actually ran out of addresses back in the 90s. Originally, IPv4 was designed around the idea of sort of class-full routing. We had class A's, B's, C's. That didn't scale. We needed more flexibility. Now, while you still may refer to a /8 network as a class A network, what it really means is we now have flexible CIDR masks. We can subnet at will, but that in turn made routing more complex. One of the problems actually is not just that we run out of IP address space. We also run out of space in global routing tables. We could use IPv4 more efficiently maybe and wring a couple more years of IPv4 space if we do that. But the problem then is that the routing becomes more complicated because you assign smaller and smaller subnets, and that's not going to work in the long run. So today's internet is really very different. For example, we have a lot of devices that no longer have a user connected to them. If you think about 70s, 80s, people thought about mainframes and servers being connected to the internet. So it really meant that you had several users per device. Right now, it's really just the opposite. If you think about it, you probably own 4 or 5 different IP addresses just as an end user. Your cell phone, your home internet connection, your TV, whatever else you have connected to the internet. We only have 4 billion internet addresses in IPv4 if we use every single one of them. And as I mentioned, just with routing tables and such, that's not really possible. But we already have something like 7 billion people on the world. So really, we don't even have one address for every person. And that's really where we run into problems. Now, the mobile internet, back in the 70s, 80s, these were big refrigerator-sized machines. This was nothing you put in your pocket and walked around with. So things like roaming between networks and such were just not designed into IPv4. Then, of course, also security. Now, over the years, IPv4 has gained a lot of security features. For example, IPsec was added in IPv6. That's now a proper part of the protocol, and it's fully integrated, which, of course, makes implementation of it easier in real networks. So the design goals of IPv6 are really the scaling. So we want more addresses, we want simpler routing most of all, and then also adjusting for modern hardware. We now have 64-bit CPUs. In IPv4, we only had 32-bit addresses, which are not very efficiently processed by 64-bit CPUs. And then we have things like more memory and, of course, mobile devices. Just for those of you here who do know a little bit about headers and network diagrams and such, I put a little IPv6 header here just to give you an impression of what it looks like. And really the main message I want to get across here is it's fairly simple. IPv6 really focuses on the core responsibility of IP. IP is all about moving packets from site A to site B. So it's all about addresses and then very little else. We do have a payload length here just to tell us how big the packet is. Routers need to know it. We do have a next header that tells us what comes next. We do have a hop limit to sort of count how many hops we went through and avoid loops. But that's really it. If you compare it to the IPv4 header, the IPv4 header is a lot more complex because it tries to do more. For example, fragmentation. Fragmentation is not dealt with by the IPv6 header. The checksums. Really, IP is just about moving the packet. It's not about reliability and not really about security and such. That's the job of protocols like IPsec and TCP and such. So all of that got removed from IPv6 to really focus on the core responsibility of the protocol, which is routing. Now, you may ask, hey, where did all the fun go? You know, fragmentation, checksums, and things like that. We need fragmentation. So how can we still do it? And how are protocols like IPsec, for example, integrated with IPv6? And that's where the big difference comes in between IPv4 and IPv6. IPv4 was not really extendable. We had to sort of duct tape on protocols like IPsec. Now, in order to do this in IPv6, we do have what's referred to as extension headers. Extension headers are added after the IP header as needed. So, for example, fields like fragmentation are only added if we actually have fragmentation. In IPv4, most of your IPv4 traffic is not fragmented, but still we have to carry these additional fields around with us whether or not they're needed. In IPv6, all of that moved to extension headers. And that's where really sort of the complexity in IPv6 comes from. IPv6, even though the proper simple IPv6 header is a lot simpler than IPv4, is actually a lot more complex due to these extension headers. These extension headers are essentially shimmed in between your IPv6 and your protocol header. And here as an example, I just have a simple packet. Probably 90+% of the IPv6 traffic that you're going to see on your network looks just like that. An IPv6 header and then a protocol header. Here a TCP header, could be a UDP header, could be an ICMP header, just like they're used to in IPv4. But let's say you need fragmentation. So what happens now is that you shim in this fragmentation extension header. Now, you're not limited to one extension header. You can have multiple extension headers. The order is somewhat recommended for these extension headers, but really your routers, your intrusion detection systems have to be ready to deal with these extension headers in any order. And this is where a lot of the complexity in IPv6 comes from. And as I usually tell people that are in security, that's where the real secret is, why we in security kind of want IPv6. There's a lot of flexibility, a lot of possibilities for implementation areas, and that's one of the first sort of problems with IPv6 I want to mention here. We don't really know yet how good these IPv6 stacks are. The last IPv4 vulnerability that was sort of in common operating systems was about 3-4 years ago. So what really is happening is we are running out of IPv4 vulnerabilities, and we need more vulnerabilities for security professionals, job security. So this is sort of one thing a lot of people are afraid of. We just don't have the operational experience with IPv6. Now, let me just give you a quick outline here. I want to sort of highlight some of the security issues with a couple of topics that are commonly mentioned. First, I want to talk a little bit about privacy. That's, of course, sort of on a lot of people's mind. Then a little bit about network address translation, which in particular for small businesses and home users is a very important defensive technology. And then two sort of specific issues, fake routers, and then what happens if you think you don't run IPv6, but you actually do run IPv6. How do you have to adjust some of your controls here? So let's start with privacy. I kind of had to almost laugh when I saw this last year. Hey, the FBI can't track you if you run IPv6. What other argument do you need to implement IPv6? But then on the other hand, there are people that are afraid of IPv6 and believe that it does provide less privacy. What this is really all about is IPv6 addresses. And just here a quick poll again. Anybody here concerned about privacy with IPv6 or not? Or who has sort of given up on privacy and basically figures that it doesn't really matter? Let me just give you a couple seconds here to fill out this poll. Okay, let me just move on here. And it's 50% or so are concerned. The rest, I would say, half. Of course, now with all the late news, a lot of people have sort of given up on privacy and figure there is no privacy, sort of delegated it to a legacy concept. But let's look at these IPv6 addresses. One of the issues with IPv6 that is often concerned sort of against privacy is that there is no more network address translation. Every host connected to the IPv6 internet has potentially a fully routable IP address. Now, the way these IP addresses break down is the first half, noted in red here, is identifying the network. The second half is identifying the host within that network. What will typically happen, for example, for a home user, and if you have, for example, a Verizon cell phone, that's already happening, the network part is assigned to you by your provider, like Verizon in that case. The interface part is picked by your host. So if you tether a couple of devices off your host, then you'll get different interface parts, but the network part is the same. The problem is, from a privacy perspective, how is this host part selected? Now, when IPv6 originally came out, it was proposed that the host part is derived from the MAC address. What this means is that the last part of your IP address never changes, even if you change networks. So if you connect your laptop to your cell phone, if you connect it to your cable modem at home, if you connect it to your work network, the last 64 bits stay the same. And that, of course, can be used as somewhat a global cookie. MAC addresses aren't globally unique, but they're pretty much globally unique, and certainly there are some privacy problems. So what happened now is that modern operating systems, and here I'm talking about all versions of Windows, Linux, OS X, do implement something called privacy-enhanced and temporary addresses. Your host will pick a random 64 bits for the host part and actually will change it once a day in order to provide some protection against tracking. The first half will still stay the same, but the first half is really just what now your global assigned IPv4 address is like. For enterprises, of course, that's a little bit of a problem if all your hosts renumber themselves once a day. So in that case, you still have DHCP to assign the last 64 bits, or you could just assign static addresses. So in general, the recommendation here is if you're concerned about privacy, and like I said, all the home operating systems will do that, then you should use privacy-enhanced addresses that will change once a day. And probably for a home network, a small business network, you don't really sort of track assets that much. Anyway, if you want more management, then you can use DHCP, and pretty much anything sort of works just like before. So overall, really, not too much changed when it comes to privacy and your IP address. Your network provider will still know what 64 bits they assign to you. So just like they now know what a global IPv4 address they assign to you, and what you do with the last 64 bits is kind of up to you, just like what you're now doing with NAT within your local network. So when we talk about NAT, let's just talk a little bit of what happened to NAT. Now, NAT was never really supposed to be a security feature, and it doesn't really provide isolation, but it provides something very close to isolation. And like I said, for home networks and small businesses that really don't want to spend a lot of effort in configuring network firewalls, it has become a very important security feature. Now, first of all, NAT is back in IPv6. This was a very controversial decision, and there was a lot of resistance, because one of the problems is you want IPv6 to kind of get rid of all the complexities that NAT added to network design, and in part, NAT was one of those workarounds that we needed because we ran out of IP addresses. However, there is a reserved address space. Those addresses start with FD, Foxtrot, Delta, and then you essentially just pick another 40 random bits, and you got here a /48 that you can use inside your organization. Compare that to your 10 dot addresses in IPv4. Vendors started implementing this. There is a fairly recent RFC that defines this, and it's really called prefix translation. So what will happen, again, the last 64 bits will actually not be touched by this form of NAT. Just the first 64 bits from this SD network will be translated into whatever network was publicly assigned by your ISP. And this goes by several different names, and I sort of showed a couple of implementations of this particular protocol. However, one thing I want you to consider is if you implement IPv6 and redo your network, why not do it right this time and try to do it without NAT? And I just put a little cartoon up here of a simplistic kind of small business network. You have on the right-hand side essentially end devices. In the center, you have a proper demilitarized zone, or DMZ, separated by a firewall from your internal network and a firewall to this big dark cloud of the internet here. What you can do now with IPv6 is something you could have done in IPv4, but you never really bothered to do because you had NAT available. What you want to do is you want to terminate all connections on proxies which are located in this demilitarized zone. A mail server, for example, would also fit in here within those two firewalls. So your internal systems never really need a direct connection to that big dark internet cloud. So as a result, when you assign addresses, you just assign these unique local or these FD addresses internally. You don't assign globally routable addresses to your internal systems, and the outside really only sees the global address of your proxy, not the one for individual workstations or phones or whatever you have connected to your internal network. So you could have done this with IPv4, but a lot of people didn't bother because NAT was available. So in IPv6, we now have NAT back in again, but try to consider this, and maybe if you start from the scratch with a new network for IPv6, you can actually implement that and improve security on your network. Now, because IPv6 NAT was only sort of added back to the standard recently, there is a hope that there is better vendor support for this kind of configuration, and there may be some actually advanced features that you don't really find that much in IPv6 firewalls and intrusion detection systems yet, like the packet inspections that you can offload to a proxy. So with IPv6, we really get some of these new design capabilities that we had in IPv4, but because our IPv4 network grew over time, we never really implemented it this way. There's another sort of new technology in IPv6 that has some significant security implications, and that's router advertisements. Now, in IPv4, we typically have DHCP. Router advertisements are really something sort of DHCP-like. You no longer really need a DHCP server. Instead, you have a router that advertises what network address it is managing, it is routing for, and it's then advertising that net block. It's just advertising the first 64-bit, and your host picks the last 64 bits using one of these methods we discussed earlier. And in addition, it may actually also provide you with a DNS server. So you get an address, you get DNS. That's really what IPv4 DHCP does for a lot of networks, and we got it all in the router, so we don't really need a separate device or a separate daemon running. The problem here is, what if someone advertises a fake router? So someone adds a router on a compromised system on your network, and even though you run IPv6 or you don't think you run IPv6, is now starting to advertise an IPv6 network. It's really sort of like having a fake DHCP server in the network. Now, for a fake DHCP server, a lot of switches offer a feature called DHCP snooping. DHCP snooping essentially tells the switch, hey, the DHCP server is connected on this particular port. If you see another DHCP server, don't allow any DHCP advertisements. On IPv6, we start seeing now a similar feature for router advertisements called RAGuard, or Router Advertisement Guard. Now, in order for this feature to work, the router has to figure out if the switch has to figure out if a particular packet is a router advertisement. The way this happens is there is the next header field in the IP header that tells us what's the next header. The switch checks, is this ICMP v6, which is used for router advertisements, and then it checks if the ICMP type is a router advertisement. So theoretically, the switch would only have to look at the first 42 bytes of the header. However, because it's IPv6, it's not really all that simple. So while we have RAGuard in modern switches, it only looks at the first 40-something bytes of the packet. We can easily bypass this protection if we add an extension header. If we add an extension header that doesn't really do anything, there are these destination headers, for example, we could use here, then the next header field in the IP header will say, hey, the next header is not ICMP, it is a destination header. Then in the destination header, there's a new next header field that will tell us, hey, the next header is an ICMP v6 header. So with this, the switch, if it would implement it properly, has to do a lot more work. In addition, those extension headers can be up to 2 kilobytes in size, which means that on some Ethernet networks that only have an MTU of 1,500 bytes, these packets get fragmented, and now your switch has to do defragmentation, which is something switches don't typically like to do. So you need a lot more horsepower on your switch to implement this feature in IPv6 compared to IPv4. If you have an old switch and you firmware upgrade it for IPv6, it likely doesn't have the necessary hardware in order to support all of this. So RAGuard bypass is a real problem, and at this point, switches can't really deal with these more complex features. If the packet is fragmented, then the switch no longer happens to actually recognize that this is a router advertisement, and even with RAGuard enabled, it will allow these packets to pass. But what if you don't use IPv6 yet? One common sort of attitude of network administrators is what I kind of call the slumlord attitude to network security. If it's not required, we remove it. Like if you're in apartments, you only really have to provide whatever HUD rules ask for. Interior doors are optional. If tenants tend to break them, why not just remove them? Similar in network security, if a feature isn't required, let's remove it and just not bother with the hassle. Well, the problem is every modern operating system does implement and enable IPv6 by default. Microsoft actually tells you do not disable IPv6 in modern versions of Windows. You will be running in an unsupported configuration. And Microsoft no longer tests, for example, patches with IPv6 turned off. Let me talk about a specific scenario where this may matter, even if you're not supporting IPv6 in your internal network. Let's say you are in a hotel, at the conference, at the client, whatever, and you want to connect back to a corporate resource. One of the common technologies being used is IPsec, a VPN. Now, let me just check here. How many of you use IPsec or any kind of VPN, even SSL-based VPNs like OpenVPN or such, when you're trying to use an untrusted network, like in a coffee shop or, like I said, at a hotel conference and whatnot else? Let's just see how many people answered here. Yeah, I have 72%. It's very typical. Only 11% don't use it. It's a good idea to use something like a VPN to route your traffic and make sure that local malicious users can't see and sniff your traffic. The problem is what you're actually doing is in current implementations is you route all IPv4 traffic via the VPN. You do not route IPv6 traffic via the VPN. So if this local network starts offering IPv6, your host will configure itself to use IPv6, and IPv6 traffic will no longer use your VPN. Okay, so with this configuration, the attacker will be able to intercept IPv6 traffic, but not IPv4 traffic. And probably a lot of resources that you're sort of concerned about are using IPv4 only, so the attacker will not see the traffic. But then again, remember, Google, Facebook, a lot of these large sites are IPv6 enabled. However, for the attacker, there is a special trick they can implement here. And that trick is called DNS64. There is a specific feature in DNS if you have an IPv6 only network that no longer uses legacy protocols like IPv4. In that case, your host will only ask for IPv6 addresses. Now, a lot of end resources are IPv4 only. So your DNS server actually plays a little trick where it looks up IPv4 and IPv6 address, and if only the IPv4 address comes back, then the DNS server will convert it to an IPv6 address. So now, no matter what IP address your host looks up, it will always get an IPv6 address back, and IPv6 is preferred over IPv4, so you will start using IPv6. The other trick the attacker has to implement is IPv6 to IPv4 NAT. And again, there are standard solutions to do that. Now, what happens if the attacker sets up not just an IPv6 router, but also an IPv6 DNS server that implements DNS64, then all of a sudden all your traffic is IPv6, and as a result, well, your VPN will actually be not very busy. Your network speed may actually go up in this scenario because the VPN usually adds additional overhead and additional routing. Like if you are here, I'm in Florida, and your corporate VPN endpoint is in California, then no matter where you go, you always sort of add this across the country kind of hop. Once the attacker here intercepts your traffic, well, you no longer do that, and your performance will go up. So what could possibly go wrong? We looked at a couple of different network implementations. For example, if I tether my Mac laptop off my Verizon iPhone, which offers IPv6, IPv6 traffic is routed directly without going through my VPN. The built-in Windows IPsec solution doesn't appear to be doing that. It automatically turns off IPv6 when you only have an IPv4 VPN connection, so it appears to do that right, at least in the testing I have done so far. With that, let me go on to another sort of security issue. One thing that you will have happen here, of course, is what is your IPS or your IDS, your intrusion detection system, and your intrusion protection system going to do with IPv6? And there is sort of one particular problem that has been difficult in IPv4 and becomes only more difficult in IPv6. And that's the problem of reassembling TCP sessions. Now, I mentioned earlier that IP is just responsible for getting the packet to the destination. IPv4 or IPv4 or v6 is not responsible for ordering packets. It's not responsible for making sure all packets make it, so there's no reliability in IP. And actually what happened sort of historically is that IP was split out of TCP. The reason we started with IP version 4 is actually it started out as TCP, and TCP version 4 added this routing component IP. And TCP is responsible for ordering packets and ensuring reliability. One important concept how TCP does that is the idea of a sequence number. Each packet includes a sequence number, and that sequence number increments with each byte I send. So if I start with sequence number 10, I send you the string hello with 5 characters. Then the next sequence number you're expecting is sequence number 15. And then the recipient is able to reassemble all of that. The problem here is that sometimes packets get lost, or packets don't get lost, but the acknowledgement gets lost. So I'm sending you the same packet twice just because you didn't acknowledge it, even though you already received it. And the entire process of actually reassembling these TCP streams isn't trivial, and different operating systems implement different solutions here. For example, if you get the same content twice, do you take the first or the second copy of that particular content? Also, the packets that are being resent aren't identical copies. By the time I realize I have to resend that packet, I may have more content for you, so I send you now a larger packet that includes the earlier packet but additional content. So that's why some operating systems take the first copy, others take the second copy, and the details of this have been a long existing problem in IPv4. And I think just over the last couple of years, really, a lot of IDSs have sort of really grasped how to do this correctly in IPv4. Well, in IPv6, we add a couple additional features that make it actually harder for the IDS to figure out what's accepted and what's not accepted, and these are extension headers. Some of these extension headers may cause the packet to actually be ignored by the destination. So now the IDS, your intrusion detection system, has to be able to figure out whether or not the packet is used based on what extension header is used. And for example, in IPv4, pretty much anything we can do in IPv4 to mess up the packet is within the TCP header. Things like options and such, or in the IP header, like the TTL. In IPv6, we do have the extension headers to add additional complexity here. So, for example, a routing header. What I can do with the routing header is I can tell the recipient of the packet, hey, you're not the actual final recipient of the packet. Pass this packet on to someone else. So what I could do in an attack is I could send the same content twice. So, for example, the way the routing header works here is I use a routing header with a number of routers that I want the packet to go through. I start out by sending the packet to router number 1. Once router number 1 receives it, it will rewrite the IP header to replace router 1 for router 2 until it ends up at the final destination. So the problem is the IP header keeps changing. If my IDS looks at the packet that I sort of circled in green here, it may think that the packet will actually end up at router 2 if it doesn't look at the routing header. But what's really going to happen is that the router 2 will forward the packet to the final destination. So as an IDS, I may actually ignore this particular packet, think it will never make it to the final destination if it will actually make it. And these complexities will make writing a good intrusion detection system for IPv6 so much harder. And this is just one example. For example, I could use destination headers to then tell the destination, hey, drop this packet. I could add unknown destination header options, which the IDS doesn't know about, but the destination knows. So the IDS thinks it will get dropped because it doesn't know what that option does, but the destination does. So there are a lot more complexities here, in particular if it comes down to how these particular problems are implemented and solved in operating systems. Well, with this, we do have a quick summary. So should you implement IPv6? Well, it's really a business decision. The way Microsoft put it once, it's about threat equity. Threat equity refers to the amount of threat that you accept because you already run IPv4. So if you run IPv4, you accept a certain threat and you decided for your business it's worth implementing IPv4 because, well, you derive enough business benefits from it. You have to look at it similarly with IPv6. IPv6 does have some new security options. Like I mentioned, IPsec is now better integrated. You have this ability to separate your networks better. Inventory control is easier if you have less NAT. But you don't have the operational experience yet. So there are a lot of unknowns here, and you really need to start experimenting now before it becomes sort of a business emergency. The problem is the business need may not be that you are running out of IP addresses. The business need may be that a customer, a supplier is running out of IP addresses, that someone like, for example, Verizon and Comcast starts aggressively rolling out IPv6. So now your end users start having IPv6 addresses and only NATed IPv6 addresses. So traditional IPv4 security protocols like IPv6 may no longer work with IPv4, but will only work with IPv6. Just a little addition here. I mentioned the operational experience. One thing we sort of do with the Internet Storm Center is sort of provide a little collaborative information security community. So if you have anything you want to share, you want us to write up, let us know. As you start implementing IPv6, one of the important things we have to do is, as a community, is to sort of share that operational experience so we don't have to make all of these mistakes again and again ourselves. Just a couple other ways how to contact me. Here is my email address and then my Twitter account if you want to follow me. I also do a daily podcast with sort of a security summary. And then we do have a number of additional resources here. If you're interested in IPv6, For example, this test IPv6.com URL, it will tell you if you have IPv6 or not and how completely you implemented it. RIPE, that's the European Network Registrar, has a number of great IPv6 resources here at IPv6actnow.org. Also posted here the link to Microsoft's IPv6 resource. If you just search Microsoft IPv6, you should end up with that. That URL is a little bit hard to remember. And if you want to play with IPv6, one thing you need is IPv6 addresses and IPv6 access. TunnelProco.net, it's a free service provided by Hurricane Electric. They will give you IPv6 connectivity even if your ISP doesn't provide it. Anyway, so with this, I believe I hand it back to Tom here, and we are ready for our Q&A.
Thank you, Johannes. Your first question is, with bigger headers, doesn't it make it more vulnerable to DDoS attacks? Also, it's a two-part question. As the IPv6 header has a different format, how does this affect intrusion detection systems?
Yeah, first of all, with the denial of service attacks, yes, this is certainly a problem. A lot of routers right now don't process IPv6 as efficiently as IPv4. For example, there are implementations of IPv4 routing in hardware. They start showing up for IPv6, but in particular, if you use multiple extension headers, they usually take up a lot more resources in your router than they do in IPv4. So there's certainly a denial of service potential. Regarding the different IPv6 header, your IDS has to explicitly support IPv6, and that's something sort of intrusion detection systems started to learn the last few years, how to properly support that. The two IDSs that I know that support IPv6 pretty well at this point is the open source IDS Snort. Also, actually, a third one, open IDS Suricata is one that supports it well. Commercial IDSs, in addition to, of course, the commercial offerings around Snort, StoneSoft is a small company that was just recently acquired by McAfee that supports IPv6 pretty well.
Great. Sounds like it's time to put pressure on the vendors. Our next question comes from Bruce. Do privacy-enhanced host addresses mean random 64-bit numbers, being random 64-bit numbers, make it harder for attackers to run port scans?
Yes, finding hosts on a network is a lot harder with IPv6 than IPv4 because the smallest network is a /64, so 64 bits, which is 4 billion squared hosts. So really finding random systems like you were able with IPv4 is almost impossible in IPv6.
Great. Our next question comes from Yogesh. He asks, why is IPv6 not used everywhere yet?
The problem is really that a lot of systems don't implement IPv6 yet, and it's in many ways also ISPs not supporting it. I mentioned Verizon and Comcast as two ISPs that very aggressively roll it out here in the US, but you will have, for example, a hard time finding native IPv6 connectivity at colocation or hosting providers. It really takes them some time to get their equipment and their software in particular ready for it. One thing in addition to intrusion detection systems that's really lacking right now is anything that looks at logs, log management software, also IP address management software. There isn't a lot out there yet that supports IPv6 properly.
Great. So here's an easy one from Pradeep. He asks, so we're going from IPv4 to IPv6. What happened to IPv5?
Yeah, IPv5 is a little bit of a sad story. In the 70s, someone came up with a real-time streaming protocol that's supposed to support real-time audio. For this protocol, they defined the first 4 bits of the IP header as 5. The first 4 bits of the IP header are also the IP version. Now, because it was kind of used for this never really implemented protocol, this number is poisoned and was skipped. The next version of IP could very well be IPv7, so there's nothing magic about skipping odd numbers here.
So our next question comes from Jay, who asks, is IPv6 really secure given the recent revelations about the NSA?
As far as the NSA is concerned, it doesn't really change anything. IPv6 is potentially more secure because the NSA is running into a lot of trouble, just like intrusion detection system vendors and such, I would imagine, in analyzing IPv6 traffic. And that was sort of the quote I had initially with the FBI kind of suggesting you don't use IPv6 because they can't track you yet. Now, overall, the protocol hasn't really changed that much, so it doesn't really address that issue at all. As far as IPsec is concerned, the protocols used for IPsec, like the encryption protocols and such, are the same in IPv6 as in IPv4. So if the NSA is able to break IPsec for IPv4, they probably can do the same for IPv6 and vice versa.
Our next question comes from Mukund, who asks why IPv6 is not overtaken IPv4. What are the major impediments to its deployment?
Like I mentioned, two things are vendor support and operational experience. Network administrators are notoriously scared of making large changes in the network. They're created on uptime. Any change like this affects uptime, and that's why they will not implement it unless there's significant business reason for doing so. Now, I mentioned over the last couple of years, software vendors like IDS vendors and such have added IPv6 to their features, but again, it means you have to buy new software, you have to upgrade, you have to learn this new software. So unless there's a real business need, people will not implement IPv6.
Our next question comes from Sarav. With respect to NAT, wouldn't it be harder to manage port forwarding, I assume it means inbound port forwarding, with each device choosing its own host address?
That's correct. And what you would have to do in this case is devices where you need inbound traffic, you would need static or these MAC-assigned addresses. Now, if you do NAT anyway, then there's really no point in using these privacy-enhanced addresses inside your network because they won't be revealed anyway to the outside because they will be NATed. So in this case, you probably are going to use MAC address-derived addresses internally or just use DHCP to assign addresses internally, and then you don't have the problem where your network renumbers itself every day.
The next question is, in what time frame are companies or organizations expected to make the move to IPv6? Has a deadline been set by any government organizations or any other deadlines that could make an emergency situation and therefore a hasty move?
The two big deadlines are for the U.S. government. One actually just expired late last year that required all public government systems to be accessible via IPv6. And if you now go to a lot of government websites, they are IPv6 accessible. Now, a year from now, basically end of 2014, they're supposed to make all internal government networks IPv6 capable. So we'll see how that goes. There's, again, a resistance against that. Already for the last couple of years, any government purchase had to be IPv6 capable. And that's actually, if you are thinking about converting to IPv6 for the next 5 years or so, if you buy new equipment today, you could look at these U.S. government standards, what they require from their vendors, and put similar language into your request for proposals to actually make sure that equipment you buy today will still work sort of 3 to 5 years down the road. In my opinion, it's about 3 to 5 years that you should expect to implement IPv6 if you don't have plans already. Deadlines that are looming here is in particular on the mobile side. already the ARIN, the North American Address Registrar, told mobile ISPs that they will not receive new IPv4 space for any LTE modems. So if you start seeing more LTE devices in your environment, they'll either use something called carrier grade NAT, which means their IP address in IPv4 space will change on a minute-to-minute basis, or they will support IPv6. And so over the next 1 to 2 years, you'll see a lot of this happening with mobile devices. And beyond that, as ISPs like Comcast roll it out more, and that's of the 3 to 5 year time frame, you'll see end users, home users, that will ask for IPv6 connectivity because IPv4 will use carrier grade NAT for them, which breaks a lot of protocols.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of mobile, do mobile device operating systems generally have IPv6 support already?
Yes, iOS, Android do have IPv6 support and support it very well. So as soon as the mobile providers offer it, your device will use IPv6. One of the problems actually both in Android and iOS, which are the systems I tested, it's hard to tell. The native configuration interfaces will not tell you that you're using IPv6. So some of these sites I mentioned, like testipv6.org and such, are useful to figure out whether or not your mobile device uses IPv6, or you have to install additional apps that will tell you what the IPv6 address of your device is.
Let's see. Oh, that last question comes from Carl, and this next question also comes from someone else named Carl, who asks, does IPv6 allow better encryption schemes than DES?
Yes, it does. IPv6 does allow all encryption schemes that are possible in IPv4, IPsec, so triple DES, AES, and such, all of that is possible.
Our next question is, should I have my SSHD at home only listen on IPv6 to avoid brute force attacks?
Yes, that's actually a very good idea, and I do see a lot of people do that. If you have a home server that nobody but you needs to know about, first of all, I would change the port number to something else than the default port, but also running it in IPv6 only makes it essentially impossible to find.
Next question comes from John, who asks, what's the status of IPv6 deployment in India? I
actually was in India earlier this year and taught an IP intrusion detection class there, and it appeared that there is no real IPv6 penetration, kind of like here, which surprised me a little bit because Asia was one of the regions that ran out of IP addresses first, because there is the most growth there. But enterprise at large ignored at this point.
Thank you. Susan asks, what about security in tiny devices, like the Internet of Things?
The problem here is, so small devices do frequently now implement IPv6, and the IPv6 standard requires that IPsec, so VPN, is implemented with IPv6. However, in particular for these small devices that don't really have a lot of CPU power, some vendors choose to ignore that guidance. And more recently, there has been sort of a little change here where it's suggested but not required. That's kind of sad, and I would, again, lean on your vendors that they do implement IPsec, because then you can really implement sort of these encrypted end-to-end tunnels. But another problem that's not really IPv6 related is that a lot of these small devices, because of their small CPU power and such, do have bad random number generators. Now, I've seen some sort of SCADA devices that use random radio noise to get better random numbers, but that has been a problem, for example, in ARM, which have one CPU architecture that didn't implement random number generators correctly. We'll see how that goes, but at this point, if anything, you're probably going to gain security with an IPv6 capable device because it is likely going to support IPsec.
Great. Hopefully, well, we have just a little bit of time left. Let's take a question from Johan, who asks, does privacy enhance addressing, since your address changes every 24 hours, how does currently active communication get affected?
The way it works is that it will keep the addresses around for 7 days. So the old address is still usable, but it will no longer be used to establish new connections. Now, after 7 days, you may lose these long-established connections. You can adjust the time frame, and that's different operating systems do allow you to adjust how often these addresses are refreshed and how long they're being kept around for.
Great, thank you. Well, I'm afraid it looks like we've run out of time. I'd like to thank Johannes Ullrich again for his informative presentation and insightful answers to the many questions that came in. And of course, I'd like to thank you, our audience, for joining us today. This webinar was recorded and will be, oh, go ahead.
Okay, I was just going to say, if anybody has any questions, just feel free to email me, and thanks everybody for coming.
Great. This webinar was recorded and will be available online in a few days at learning.acm.org, where you can also find announcements on upcoming webinars and other ACM activities. We ask all attendees to please fill out the survey by clicking on the URL on your screen. This is also where you can suggest future topics or speakers. This is Tom Limoncelli saying, see you at the next ACM Learning webinar. Hope you can join us next time.